you so much for joining again the second week or the second event of the Social Impact Week. On behalf of the Social Impact and Responsibility Club, I would like to wholeheartedly thank all the audience, both the Zoom audience and the WeChat live stream audience. It was a great honor to receive your great feedback. For today, we have selected a topic that we hope that you will find it insightful and, in the end of the day, inspiring. So we are going to talk about business solutions to societal challenges, a case from Africa. We are very delighted to have with us Mr. Pezzoli. Mr. Pezzoli is the Executive Director of TATS Foundation. Prior to joining TATS, Mr. Pezzoli was a senior manager of McKinsey, where he served major clients in the private health sector and in government and regulatory authorities across Europe, America, and the Middle East. Mr. Pezzoli has a very interesting academic background, I would say. He has a PhD in biomedical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He has a Master of Science in Health Economics, Policy and Management from the London School of Economics, and he has a Master in Aerospace Engineering from the Polytechnic of Milan. We are very honored to have Professor He with us to lead the discussion after Ms. Pezzoli's presentation. Professor He is a professor of strategy at CEIBS. Prior to joining CEIBS, he was a professor in Department of Management of the School of Business and Management of Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His research interests focus on corporate governance, corporate social responsibility, competitive dynamics, and competition. Professor He is teaching the core course, Business, Society, and Environment in our MBA during our MBA course, but he's also teaching the same subject throughout the whole program of the CEIBS.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here today. It's a real pleasure actually to be here to share my experience with TATS Foundation and specifically about the way we work in Africa. Elena already introduced myself, so let me just maybe say a few words about the TATS Foundation before we dive into the content. So we are a non-for-profit organization headquartered in New York. The entire team is, however, deployed in sub-Saharan Africa. We work mostly with governments and private sector players across the region. And the idea is the goal is for us to design and implement solutions, specifically in the health sector, with the goal of expanding quality and access to health services for the general population. Important to mention here is that all team members of TATS Foundation come from the private sector, as by the way our board does. And as you will see during the presentation, our way of thinking and our approach to solving problems is deeply rooted in the private sector approach. What I would like to talk to you today about is specifically how in this, I would say, 20 years of experience on the ground, we have slowly realized how incentives and norms, I would say typical of the private sector, can be extremely successful when applied to what I call the social sector, to achieve, by the way, what we've been trying to achieve forever, right? That is deep and sustainable impact. All of those actors, such as NGOs, funding organizations, philanthropists, but also governments, and private sector players and firms, when specifically they are focusing on solving societal challenges. Then, when I was asked to give this presentation, there was one specific concept that was business solutions, right? And the concept of business solution is an interesting one because it is pretty clear what it means in the realm of the private sector. But the question I was asking myself is, what does it really mean in the context of the social sector? And when people talk to me about the beauty of business solutions, they always refer to those kinds of solutions that are paid for by the customers and therefore successful and intrinsically sustainable. So you have a product, people see the value of the product, they're willing to pay for it, and the solution is considered sustainable and successful. Great. And this, by the way, can also happen in the context of the social sector, right? For example, if you think about health insurance schemes sold in many different countries across the globe, those kind of health insurance schemes are a way for people to access healthcare services avoiding catastrophic. This is a good example, I think, of a good business solution. However, when we look at what historically the social sector has been driven and sustained by, we see a completely different picture. We see donations made by large organizations, multi and bilateral organizations, and individual philanthropists. And those systems have been often criticized heavily with the idea that if a system is funded by a donor, it is not going to be sustainable in the long term. And what I think is the following. While this is not always the case, we all have seen here and there the negative consequences of this model. And this happens when, for any reason, donor funding streams stop. Now, is there any middle ground here between the two extremes, meaning between a solution that is fully funded by a donor or a solution that is fully funded by the willingness to pay of the general population? So what about, for example, government subsidizing services for the population? Is this considered a sustainable business solution? Now, is the key determinant of successful and sustainable solutions who is paying for it? And this is what I really want to focus our attention right now. Or is there anything else we need to take into account? So what I want to highlight here is that the key to consider a solution successful and sustainable is not only who's paying for it, but also who's providing the services, and even more what kind of incentives we have across these players. Incentives that should be there to make it sustainable. So from my experience, you can have strong and sustainable solutions that we can consider, in my opinion, business solutions, using a hybrid model led and funded by partnerships. Through partnerships, by the way, and we will see what this means, between several different players, governments and private sector players. Now, people often refer to these models as PPPs, right? Private sector partnership, and many countries are trying to heavily push for those. But what I would like really to discuss with you right now, we're gonna deep dive into the content, is the following. What should we do to increase our chances of success when adopting those kind of hybrid solutions? Okay, and I'm now years in Africa with Touch Foundation, not myself, but Touch Foundation from 20 years in Africa, and what we have really witnessed on the ground. So there are three key principles that I want to go through today with you. And I can tell you right now that those are the principles that we have adopted at Touch, which have made a massive difference in the impact we have been able to achieve so far. When I look at 10 years ago, when we were not actually using those kind of principles compared to now. A different way to see this is, can we minimize our risk of failure? And there are three major principles I want to focus on. Think differently, seek through partnership, and raise the bar. And I will make examples of what this means in the concept of, in a real life example of the program we have in Africa. So first, think differently, and actually I would add, think local. This is very important. So when you design the right solution for a problem you are trying to solve, obviously, the design is key. And what best practice, for example, is in another setting. People tend to look at the outside world and think, okay, look, this is working well here, let's replicate this there. Or even worse, recently, with all of the recent developments in technology and IT, look, this brand new technology is bringing leapfrog improvements in this specific setting. Why don't we try to replicate as is in another one? And from our experience, this is the perfect recipe for failure. We need to take into account local constraints, and I'm not only talking about financial constraints, but also about cultural and behavioral constraints. Let me get into a real example of what I mean here. So we have a program, we started a program a few years ago in Tanzania called Emama. The Emama program started because of one reason. By living there, by being on the ground every day, we realized that there was a missing piece of the health system. There was no way for women and newborns, especially women in this case, experiencing an emergency delivery to access emergency care. So women were either dying in their home or they were often dying in lower level facilities because they had no means to get transported to a place where they could have been taken care of. Now, the solution that pops up in everyone's mind was the standard 911 solutions, right? Can we create, what is existing in most of the countries around the world? That is an emergency system that you can call, toll-free number, the ambulance comes, you get transported, and you're safe. But instead of using ambulances, and now I'm going back to think local here, to transport newborns and mothers, we decided to go down to a very different route and adopt what we can call a business solution here. We proposed the government to use local drivers with a car, just simple people owning a car. Now, ambulances are considered everywhere the needed solution, the best practices, right? But what you have to ask yourself here is it the case today in Tanzania? And the answer, at least our answer, was clearly no. Why are local drivers better? Several reasons. One, financial incentive. They're paid to transport women. They want to be there as soon as possible and transport them. They want to be called to do so. Two, pride. Those are local drivers living in villages. And the pride that those drivers feel in being able to help their neighbors, mothers and newborns in the area is massive. Three, better knowledge of local areas and streets. We're not in New York, in Tanzania, right? So when you have to pick up a pregnant mother, you don't have a specific address. There are no addresses in rural areas in Tanzania. And local drivers know the local, morphology and the area and the villages much better than a random driver driving an ambulance from far away. And also, by the way, very important, in Tanzania, ambulance is what? It's just an SUV. There is no equipment. There is no, personnel. So it's exactly the same of being transported with a private car. Now, was it easy? No. The government still pushed a lot, we will see this later on, for ambulances. But we knew that ambulances were not going to work. Ambulances were already there. They were usually without fuel, without driver, and even more misused because they were used by government officials to travel around. So we knew that buying more ambulances would have been a failure. Now, results. In just 2 years of operations, the first 2 years, we had 4 times the amount of transports that we were achieving before, and more than 30% decrease in maternal mortality. The program was massively successful in the pilot area, and just last week, the president of Tanzania had an official ceremony to launch the system to cover the entire country. Now, this is actually a good segue into the second concept. Seek real partnership. And this is probably the most important point that, in my opinion, will determine how successful a solution will be. When I give you the example of the MAMA program, the option to use cab drivers was, I would say, one of the most controversial, probably not the most controversial, we're going to get there later on, but one of the most controversial topics I've ever discussed with governments. They know you are backed up with by funders. They know your money, and in this case, for maternal emergencies specifically. And they were pushing to have more ambulances both. And using private cars was absolutely a no-go, was absolutely ruled out at the beginning of the conversation. Now, this is where true partnership is key. We disagreed. We had months of discussions. At the end, we agreed on using private cars because they were able to see the value of what we were thinking, bringing in terms of different thinking. Now, is this something that happens? Usually not, I can tell you. Many organizations are so entangled and embedded within the government that for them it's almost impossible to push back. And this is, in my opinion, a massive issue because what happens usually is that the agenda of the government is the only thing that matters. And by the way, it's absolutely key because the relationship should be two ways, right? In that case, we could have tried to buy more ambulances, but we knew how we would have failed. No doubt about that. We knew that the incentives for private drivers would have been much better, and having an honest and genuine discussion with the government led us to adopt the right solution. Now, by the way, partnership with the government, but this is the wrong slide, but it doesn't matter, needs really to be a two-way partnership, as I said before. They know more than you do about local settings, current needs, feasibility, but you also are bringing to the table specific expertise, long-term experience in similar settings, and the need to feel and acknowledge this. Otherwise, you will always be treated as a source of money and nothing else, and this often leads to failure. Let me add one more thing here. You not only have the right, to disagree, but I also believe that you have the moral obligation to do so, not only to ensure, that the money you're bringing to the table are used in the best possible way, but also to protect this money that are usually coming from donors. And this is very similar to what you would do in the private sectors, right? You have to protect your donors' investment as much as you have to protect your investors when you have, a startup or whatever private company you're thinking about. Now, so then raise the bar. That is probably the most intriguing one. So we always require our partners to have skin in the game. So in the example of the Mama, from day one, we agreed with the government to share the running cost of the system, starting with a larger share on our side, and in year 3, going to 100% of cost borne by the government. I can tell you that I've never heard about something similar from other organizations. Actually, and this is probably what I was referring before, when I first suggested to go down this route to one of our partners in Tanzania, they mentioned that this is absolutely unacceptable to ask the government to contribute financially when they have already several other priorities. But I think here the point is different, right? If the government does believe in the solution we are putting in place together and are willing to make it sustainable in the longer term, I don't see any reason why they will not see value in sharing the cost from day one. Once again, this I can tell you has been, seriously, the most difficult task to achieve. Even after we had the first pilot, very successful in a small district of about 700,000 people, to scale it up to an area of 2 million people, it took about 7 or 8 months discussions with single local governments to convince them to invest upfront in the system. Now, there is a second concept here after skin in the game, that is what we call the stage gate investment. And this is also crucial. This means that from time to time, at specific times during the project, usually we do it every year, we openly, with the partners, with the government, review the progress of the initiatives and have an honest go, no-go decision. So we don't commit all of the funds that we have available on day one for the next 6 or 7 years, but we renew our commitment every year. By the way, this is not only important for us, but also for the government, because the government has the same right to stop the system. So while it is important for the government to share the cost from day one, that's what we said before, it is also true that they're investing in something that may end up not being successful as we thought. So the stage gate investment approach will also give them and the fund, that we said before, the opportunity to stop program if results or progress is not satisfactory. We both keep investing only if interim results are satisfactory. Let me, these are three, what I just mentioned really are the 3 key concepts. Then clearly there are a lot more caveats that I can go through, but this is what we realized made our life much more difficult in the last 5 years, but our results at a completely different level. I want to leave some time for questions. I, on purpose, made the presentation short because I want really people to, have the opportunity to ask questions. But let me end my presentation with a simple comment here. I've seen massive waste of money within the so-called social sector in the last 10 years in Africa. And what we're trying to do at Touch is, not to completely get rid of this, waste. We also make mistakes, we waste money, it's normal. But what we're trying to do here is to maximize our chances of success, while at the same time protecting as much as possible our donors' investments. We know it's risky, but the idea of having something fully bought into the concept of the government from day one and using business solutions as the one, for example, that we'll be using with the cab drivers is for us a statement of high chances of success going forward. I strongly believe this is the right direction. Once again, it's not, this is not a silver bullet, obviously, but to be bold, to have honest partnerships with the governments and ask the government to adopt a private sector mindset can really make every day a substantial difference. Now, before we get into the questions, let me just say one thing here. I know that we have a lot of very talented people here connected today. We're always looking to, connect with smart and committed people. So if you're interested in hearing more about Touch, please, go on our website, send me or whatever, like an email. You will always find, everyone's contact over there. So I'm going to be more than happy to do so and to answer any questions. Okay? Thanks a lot. And now back to you for questions.
Mr. Pezzoli, thank you so much. It was such an interesting sharing and very, very practical to have a different view of what an NGO is doing, because I think they're very biased, and based on my experience also working in NGO. So please, Professor Hay, you are more than welcome to make the questions, and please, all the audience in the WeChat live streaming or in the Zoom, please feel free to participate. You can also participate via video if you want. Open your camera, and please, Professor, here you may start.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, for this very inspiring sharing. So your experience with Touch Foundation is certainly very informative. Now we have learned 3 principles from your sharing. Think differently, seek real partnership, and raise the bar. So the example you gave, Mama, is actually very much aligned with the idea of creating shared value. So we do have businesses who have resources, and we know there are many social and environmental problems to be solved, but we don't have a viable business model to mobilize the resources to solve the problems. So you use the example of people's cars, and then you develop a model to mobilize those cars as a resource so that some social problem can be solved. So this is very, very informative. I know you, not only you have your very interesting working experience, but your personal background is also very interesting. So I did prepare a set of questions to ask you about your foundation and also yourself. So maybe I can share my screen as well so that we can make our discussion a little more structured. So first of all, I know currently Touch Foundation is an NGO. Then compared to government, regular business, and other NGOs, what is your unique advantage in addressing the social problem you identified?
I don't know if we have an advantage, but what I can tell you is that probably there are 2 major things that we see as key determinants really in having an impact. First is, and I'm going to go back, by the way, to what I just shared with my presentation. So the first is what I could call here connections. It seems trivial, but the reality on the ground is that even if you have great solutions, if you have great ideas, as by the way it happens in even in the private sector, if you don't have the right connections, especially in the public, in the NGO world, it's going to be almost impossible to achieve results. Why? Because we have to think that around those kind of societal issues, governments are bombarded by a lot of players, and you have the private sector players who are there with their great business solutions that are really focused on having the customer pay for the solution. You have a lot of NGOs, you have a lot of grants, you have a lot of loans coming from multi and bilateral institutions, so they're really bombarded with opportunities. That's why I think that, especially for a small foundation as we are, to be able to be heard, you need to first establish yourself, and that's tough. When we started at the beginning, we had to start very small. We start in a tiny region, supporting, a major facilities in an area of 70 million people. And, by doing so, we started having visibility at the central government, and now we are a trusted partner of the central government. So I don't know if this is an advantage, but this is definitely a requirement. The only one that I would mention as an advantage, once again, I don't know if I can call it that way, is really the freedom of doing, and the freedom of being able to walk away. So we are funded by private donors, mostly. We also have some, major, large organizations. For example, we are funded by USAID, but usually we are funded by private foundations, as we are, and you have a clear relationship with them. There is a clear understanding and agreement that, okay, if we believe that it's not going to work, that is kind of, I think, ethical idea that if we believe we are missing an opportunity to have impact, we're not going to get it. I don't know if this answered your question.
Absolutely. From your action you have is one of the most valuable resources which you applied to help solve social problems. I think that also reminds me of the value of MBA education. I think our students, MBA students, usually they are sometimes they feel confused about the value of MBA education. But if you think about the connection you are developing through the MBA education, and you know how much value that connection can generate in the future, then certainly I feel my students or our students can be more invested in their MBA education, because I think through your example, you showed the value of connection. So I have the next question will be about accessibility. This is, and you mentioned you have the freedom to walk away, but we hope you can sustain your impact and you can really generate more impact in the future. Then, in order to sustain yourself, what challenges must be tackled?
That's a very interesting question, because clearly this is what every single foundation is going through. So I would say two things, right? The first one is there is a tendency among the major funders to go with what I used to call the usual suspects. There are very large, and I'm not making names here, but there are very large, well-known, well-renowned implementers that are outside there, that usually are able to access most of the funding that is available outside there. And why is this the case? Because I still believe that specifically in this environment, there is a very low appetite for risks. It's very different what you actually find in the private sectors, right? And why is this the case? Because I think one of the major concerns of those large funders is to make sure that at least you don't harm. The last thing they want is to end up on the front page of the, Wall Street Journal for a scandal, right? And usually going with usual suspects will not bring that risk to you. Going with smaller players that are maybe much more appealing in terms of what they bring to the table is, right? But they are less known in terms of the international arena, is usually perceived as a risk. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to mention here is still a reluctance of major donors and funders to really think about what is needed. When you I took the example of what we do. When you work with large funders, they tend to have very tight caps in terms of what you can use for your organizational operations and so on. And in my opinion, as by the way it has been happening also in the private sector, this is absolutely wrong. To have the idea that you have a specific for example indirect trade that is going to be hard coded in each and every budget is a mistake. What we should be judged for is the impact you are bringing, is the results you are achieving. It's exactly the same when you buy something. You don't care how much it costs. You look at how good is the item you're buying, how satisfied you are with that, and the rest, it's none of your business. But while still, you are paid in a disbursement, for example, basis more than for what you are achieving. And that's a pity, because when, if you had a different business model in place in which you can actually sell the results and reinvest what you have in addition to the results. You could also do much more, I would say, scouting and early on testing of solutions, even without the need of having larger funders backing you up. But I think this is going to take a long time to change.
All right. Yeah. So thank you. I think this is somehow connected to your previous answer to the first question as well. You mentioned the importance of establishing yourself. So I guess to sustain your foundation, you have to keep establishing yourself. In the meanwhile, maintaining the connections you have as a resource.
So let me actually, sorry, if I may, let me also ask, sorry, I say one last thing. Sometimes, and this maybe is going to be weird to hear for some people, sometimes the objectives of the different players are diverging. I'm going to be very transparent here with all of you. I've heard in the past cases in which one of the major goals of the funder was to spend the money according to plans. And even though you may have absolute, rational reasons to, for example, slow down your spending, to put on hold the program, because maybe you're waiting for a real buy-in from the government, you're waiting for something else to happen, even though in a normal environment, in a normal, once again, private sector environment, they would be absolutely needed, meaning you are protecting investment, you're not wasting money. Many times, large funders have KPIs around how quickly you're spending their money. And this is, to me, something that I've always had a very hard time to understand, because it's absolutely counterintuitive, but it is still what is happening. And this is, to me, another major constraint in terms of how you can work well with major funders.
All right, yeah, thank you. So my next question will be about your implementation. We understand strategy formulation is important, but implementation is even more important than the strategy you formulated. So what's your implementation model to increase the chance of sustaining the impact in the long run?
Okay, and this is, by the way, I like this question because this is an important point I want to make that makes us different, and sometimes we are asked about this difference with the, for example, consulting firms, right? We have like large consulting firms that are there to design programs and design solutions. We do the same, but we also implement those solutions. So what we have seen on the ground is that the best model that we are now really trying to bring ahead is a co-implementation from day one. Usually what we tend to do, and the Mama program is a perfect example, is we tend to be extremely heavily involved at the beginning. When you have to set up the process, when you have to set up the norms, when you have to really organize the work for the next 5 years and decide what needs to happen, at what pace, where, and how. Then we start really implementing, we start setting up the system. But what we always try to do, first of all, is we do it in collaboration with our partners, always. And when I say partners, I mean, it could be the government, it could also be private partners we are working with that at the end of the day, we'll have to run the system down the road. And what we try to do is to gradually phase out. So that's another important point that I didn't include in the 3 key determinants, but I think another one that could be there is prepare to leave. We know about many organizations who are there forever, and this is not the model we use. We want to be there for a specific amount of time. We want to start something. We want to help whatever the partner is to understand how to run it. We want to run it together, phase out, and see it sustain down the road. And that's exactly what has been happening right now in this kind of 2 million region in Tanzania with the Mama program. The government is now running the program by itself. We are completely outside of the picture, while we will get back into the picture now with the effort of bringing and scaling it up to the entire country. But I think this is an important point. The phasing out is something that I guess we really are, have been focusing on, because we don't want to be there forever. Let me put it this way. We want to help them solve problems and leave, and then get to the next one.
So it establishes the model, then you can hand the model over to people on the ground so that they can sustain themselves. That's how you run your implementation model. My next question will be about ESG strategies. Now ESG is really one of the hot topics, a buzzword in the corporate community, and you worked as a business consultant yourself. Then what would be your recommendation for companies who are developing their own ESG strategies?
Okay. I probably already, I maybe hinted to some of those points before, but let me just say, you have two different models, right? Usually you have companies, and also it depends a lot on what kind of ESG strategies we're talking about here, is right? It can be corporate social responsibility, could be something slightly different. There are, I see two different models. One is those companies that are actually developing in-house those kind of strategies, and they're actually also focusing on implementing those strategies. Those are usually limited. Most of the companies, in my opinion, are trying to actually outsourcing. They're trying to show the world that they're doing these things, but they're outsourcing the implementation. And my suggestion here would be similar to what I said before, is right. I mean, I was mentioning before about those organizations being risk adverse, trying to go with the with the usual solutions. I would say, to be bold, especially at this time, with all of the technology and all of the leapfrog advancement that we have seen, is key. I mean, there are massive opportunities outside there to really have stepwise improvements there. So take risks and focus on results, and not on standard KPIs. This is probably the most, in my opinion, important thing, is right. You always see the standard KPIs that are usually not output related, not outcomes related, but sometimes output related, and that's wrong, is right. I mean, who cares about the output? I want to see outcomes. I want to see impact. But obviously, impact and outcomes are much more difficult to measure, and this is why usually they end up focusing on the easier KPIs that, however, are not as telling as they should be.
All right. Yeah. So certainly, as business ESG strategy, if companies treat ESG strategy as a part of the business system, they should use the business approach to ESG issues as well. As you said, establishing KPI, then make social and environmental impact measurable. That's how you can get the results desired by society and also by the company.
If I can add one thing, I really like what you said. I think the idea of keeping the two sectors fully separated is an old idea, right? I mean, on the one side, you have the private sector. Then let me just get to a very simple concept here. Private sector, public sector, or whatever, NGO, completely different way they think. Why? Because people working with those sectors are usually very different in terms of education, in terms of salaries, in terms of experience. And that's wrong. And that's wrong. As you will see, some of the most successful organizations, for example, like the Gates Foundations, then we can discuss how much we want about what they've achieved, but they obviously have people within the organizations that could work in any organization within the private sector. That makes you think differently. That makes you be more bold, more aggressive, and really looking for excellence every time. While I can tell you, it's very difficult to find this kind of mindset in standard NGOs.
Yeah. So certainly, business practices, a business system, or business mindset has its own values, its own advantages, and it's up to us to apply what we accumulated in our business training to solve social problems. I do have some other questions. I'll skip one thing I'm really curious about, but I'll have a discussion with you later on. But I would want to ask some questions on behalf of our MBA students. So what would be your advice to our MBA students who want to pursue a socially impactful career?
By the way, MBA students are usually students who are coming, with a lot of previous experience in the private sectors, right?
Right.
So let me just tell you what I did when I decided that I wanted to do something that was more socially driven. I really had that kind of feelings, right? I mean, the work at McKinsey was very interesting, but I wanted to move from, let me be bold here, but from, supporting profitability of a pharma company, I want to move to something that had more impact in terms of people, in terms of, the most neglected and so on. So what I did at that time was, okay, where should I go? And I think this relates to the question that you have on the screen right now is, right? I mean, what should I do? Where should I go? And I don't know if it was the right decision, but at that time, I was talking to, and I had a few offers from several organizations. And what I ended up doing was to go to Touch. Why? Because I was called by the founder of Touch, that has been for 35 years a director at McKinsey. And he was telling me how this foundation is different. By the way, it was not that different 10 years ago when I joined, but it's very different now. He was telling me about his vision about a much more efficient organization, really deeply rooted with a heavy DNA within the private sector, trying to apply business solutions, try to problem solve around all of the details before even putting the foot on the floor. So I was really fascinated by the idea of using exactly the same tools, having exactly the same approach that I was having at McKinsey, but for problems that I at that time felt were much more interesting. So I think, in my case, I was lucky because I had in front of me someone who called me because he knew I was leaving McKinsey at the time. But I think to try to talk to the different to search the different options and really trying to understand if this fits, because I'm sure most of those students, MBA students, are very driven, are very charismatic. They want to do things, right? They would get super bored if they have to have a very low pace. So they should really be careful to where they end up. But there are very interesting organizations in the NGO sector, in the space that have a completely different mindset, and I think those are the ones that are usually smaller but very successful. So it's not easy to find them, but that's why I think that you really need to search a lot around you to find the right ones. And we do the same, by the way. Before hiring, we're very careful, and we feel that there is the same kind of skepticism when we talk to prospects. So I would suggest really to scan around a lot, and don't think that it's an easier field to find a place into, because actually it's not, because the risk of getting into the wrong organization is high.
So I guess to summarize, keep searching until you can settle yourself.
Talk to people.
Yeah.
Talk to people. I remember when I for example, when there was another large organization that I knew about, and I was interviewing with them, and besides interviewing, I talked to 3 or 4 people within the organization that I knew from previous work. So as much as you can know from the inside, I think that will help you a lot.
All right, great. So I also have some questions from our audience. Let me read out the questions. Maybe you can also read the questions from the chat box, but let me read out for the audience as well. So there's one question about your experience in developing countries. Government is balancing economic development and stability. Within this, there is a lot of corruption. For example, there are times government grants go to local programs where there is rebate that go back to the grantee. How do you handle these corruptions? Have you ever felt unsafe in your travels?
Okay, by the way, I lived in Tanzania for 6 years, so I was not like just going in and out. So I have to, let me start in this way. I have never felt unsafe. However, have we been asked sometimes to be part of the system that this student is, I don't know if he's a student, this person is referring to?
Our
yes.
student, Fred.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So yes, we have, and across the whole spectrum. Very rarely, by the way, if I have to remember, probably 3 times. Very, very wide spectrum, from really having to, pay to get like, a permit, a residency permit. And let me just say here, we never paid a single dollar to do anything like that, right? But we have been in that situation very rarely. Only recently we've been, in a situation in which there was a hint from a government official that he needed to get something if we wanted our program to go through. And obviously we didn't follow up on that because for us it's completely out, not really like, an issue to discuss. However, yes, those things happen often. And I know that it's similar, by the way, to the private sectors, right? I mean, you're bringing massive amount of money in the country and you have the same, right? So yes, this happens. But not to the level to feel unsafe. Let me put it this way.
All right, yeah. So the next question is, first of all, thank you for your sharing. As from my limited experience, when I worked in a social enterprise in India in 2019, it is also a tech-enabled health tuberculosis startup. I observed this and some other social organizations, social enterprises are mainly actually not having a profitable business or even no clear revenue streamlines. So part of the reason is the target user are usually low income segmentation. On the other hand, I noticed at least some of them are 100% funded by grants based on philanthropy donations. But I cannot feel if we totally not focusing on profit, but impact, is this the real impact we should chase and a sustainable one? How do you think about it? I guess to summarize the essence of the question is really, can impact and profit coexist to solving a social problem as challenging as health care system?
I come from a country, I come from Europe, and obviously have a different view compared to people potentially coming from the US, right? We see the government as a player that needs to step in to subsidize. And I strongly believe in the value of subsidization for the poorest segments of the population. Now, does this mean that all of the services for the poor need to be subsidized? No, not at all. Actually, one of the most interesting work we are doing right now in rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa is really to develop real business solutions, because here we're talking about paid for by the population in those areas where the government is not able to reach. So we're talking about countries where, in theory, many services are subsidized by the government, but in reality, this is not happening because there are no facilities close to those villages and so on. So we're trying to develop business solutions in which you can provide services at the minimal cost. Now, is this always, does this apply to all of the services? No, probably if you think about cancer services where the costs are absolutely exorbitant, you cannot even think about, having someone earning $10 a day paying for those services. But if you're thinking about like even basic services, I think there is a massive, not a massive, but let me put it this way, there is more ability to pay and willingness to pay than people think. Then the question should be, okay, but is this fair, or should the government pay for those people? But this is a different question. But to answer this question, I think there is more ability to pay and willingness to pay than people think. And also, let me just say one last thing. You have a different level of organizations, right? You have the for-profit organizations. They have to make a profit. You have the government, it's a different animal. But then you also have the the private sector non-for-profit organizations. Those organizations, such as, for example, faith-based organizations that are focused on impact, and they have the luxury not of losing money, but they have the luxury of break even. So they don't need a profit. So clearly they're also massive players in those countries to be able to serve those, the lower segments of the populations by accessing some of those funds, but not making a profit.
Right. So the people who pay may not be the person who actually enjoys the service, who use the service. So as long as you can find somebody who supports the idea, who can pay, then it's possible to develop a profitable business model in the meanwhile to solve the social problem. Then the next question is from Karen. She asks, first of all, thanks for the great sharing. Without diminishing the excellent work that the Touch Foundation has done in the slackness, I was wondering how you personally made the and the private sectors. What are the trade-offs you considered? For example, maximizing impact, personal interest, etc. For instance, did you think about creating and scaling up a health tech startup across the African continent versus working on foundation projects?
Yeah,
have you thought about starting up your own business?
No, for sure. And during these years, we had several ideas. But let me just be very blunt here. Not only about the social sector, but I also thought about going back to the private sector. I had a few very interesting offers in the past few years. The reason why I'm still here is the following. When I joined Touch Foundation, it was about 10 years ago. It was a very different organization. When I arrived in Tanzania, rural Tanzania, we were 3 of us. It was mostly a grant-making organization, giving money to a hospital and the School of Medicine in the area of the Lake Zone, period. No connections, no large programs, no ability to scale, and blah, blah, blah. In these last 10 years, we have created now a very different organization. And I think just right now, it is probably the most interesting time of Touch. Why? Because we have, for the first time, really a phenomenal team on the ground. And I can tell you, it's not easy at all to bring highly skilled people into rural Tanzania or even in Dar es Salaam. So we have a lot of people coming from AT Kearney, from Deloitte, from McKinsey. So we have an incredible team on the ground, very talented. And we now are expanding our connections to large funders. So we are at the point that I would call it how do you call this in English, inflection point, where really, we will see in the next 2 years, if we're able to really just become one of those that I used to call usual suspects, right? I mean, can we really get to a much larger space in which we can multiply our impact? I think this is what is taking me here, Karen. But obviously, this will have to be reevaluated in a few years.
All right. So we're a little over time, but I think we can entertain another question. And
I want to answer this because it's important.
Right. Yeah. So, so when you work at these NGOs or foundations, financially, is it enough to take care of a family?
Okay. We are very different. We are very different. And there are, let me just, I'm going to quickly tell you. I could answer with a question. Do you think that, for example, people working at the Gates Foundation are able to take care of a family? So why am I saying this? Because there are some organizations, and we are one of those, where salary rates are comparable to the private sector. Now, I'm not talking about fully comparable, and we don't want to be fully comparable because we also want passion from people. We want people to join us not only for the money, but also because they truly want to do good, okay? So, however, I strongly believe that, and I was hinting at that before, this world in which salary scale for NGOs are 1/10 of what you find in the private sector is ridiculous because you will never find high-skilled personnel to come to work with you, is right? No way. Now, the reason why we are able to have highly skilled people in the country is because we are very competitive compared to the private sector, very competitive. And I think this is absolutely key. I reject the concept of the public sector or the NGO world having to pay much less than the other organizations, because that is the perfect recipe for failure. Because you will never want lower skilled people to run an organization or to implement programs, because what you're gonna get is what you pay for.
All right, good to hear. The salary is comparable so that you can support your family. But of course, we as NGO, we don't only work for the salary. There's much more beyond the finance. All right, so I guess our time is up. It's really a great. Okay, Eleni has a question.
Yes, I do have a question. Let me slow. So, Mr. Pezzoli, you mentioned before, I want you to repeat that point, because I used to work in an NGO when I was in the finance department of that NGO. So you mentioned something about that the funding is not of a challenge for you. You mentioned something about funding. Could you please repeat that point?
Oh, funding, it depends. I mean, different organizations have different sources of funding, right? Usually, let me put it this way, the most stable source of funding is what it's called an endowment. And this is, hopefully something that sooner or later we're going to be able to get to. But just to give you an idea, and I think every one of you knows how endowments work, is right? You have a set amount of money, and you can usually, actually you have to, at least in the US regulation, access 5% of the capital every year to continue having the tax advantages of the endowment. I mean, think about organizations such, if I remember right, the Gates Foundation has a $30 billion endowment or something like that. So this is obviously something that everyone was dreaming about. But for the rest, I mean, let's go back to earth, right? To normal foundations. You usually are funded by individuals, and you're funded by institutional funders. For example, we are funded for our core costs mostly by individual funders in terms of our board members and some other funders. But we are now, having a strategy to enlarge a lot this kind of pool of funders. But most of the programs, actually all of our programs, are fully funded by institutional donors. And I'm talking about, just to give you a little bit of a few names. For example, the Mama program has been largely funded by the Vodafone Foundation and the Elma Foundation, that is based out of New York. We have been funded for about 15 years right now, still funded by the US Agency for International Development. So we've been funded by other, pharmaceutical CSR arms. So we have funding all over, but actually, I don't want to give the message that funding is not an issue. Funding is an issue, always an issue. That's why we are really right now developing a new development or fundraising strategy. But probably the only time where it's not an issue is when you have an endowment. Let me put it this way. And let me just say one thing, by the way, we're talking about salaries. As I said before, we're always looking for interesting people. So if you guys are interested in, when you are at whatever point of your career, shifting, you should see. We always have opening. We're always looking for talented people. So feel free to go to our website and check.
I don't have anything to ask, but I do want to share my own observation and my own learning from Massi's sharing and his answers to the questions. I think the three principles you mentioned in the beginning of your talk is very inspiring. And I think not only for running NGOs, for in regular business or even pursuing our own career, we need to if I may, let me repeat, think differently, then seek real partnership, and lastly, try to raise the bar. So those are the three things I learned. And thank you so much, Massi, for the very inspirational sharing.
Mr. Pezzoli, it was very, very interesting, very, very inspiring. We've seen from the comments and from the comments from our WhatsApp groups that we.
So that's
it was very, very interesting.
Observation.
Professor He, your signal is cutting. So, Mr. Pezzoli, thank you so much on behalf of the club for your participation and for your honor to participate in our event. Perhaps if I guess you're open if if my classmates want to connect with you or the organization.
Absolutely. You can share my email and I can direct everyone to the right person if you want to talk about. Yeah. Great. And by the way, good luck to all of the students for their studies and graduation.
And the studies, yes. Thank you so much, Ms. Pezzoli. Thank you so much. Thank you all the audience for being with us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Massi.
Thank you,
thank you, Eleni.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.